some of you have been in psychology now for a number of years, and you've probably taken like specific courses, maybe not full courses on motivation, but definitely in like an intro psych course, you would have talked about motivation. And I'm going to talk in a second about like intrinsic and extrinsic, and I know some of that's going to sound like stuff you're already familiar with, but I want to try to build this story of how I think sometimes this is like an issue in some of these top subjects where I should just set this mouse over here. It's just too much on my mind. Where it's like, well, once we've named it, then it's just something we don't need to worry about anymore. And it's like, well, no, like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is super huge, important. It's like if I can get you to actually care about something, you act differently towards it than if you're only acting towards it based on a specific reward that's tied to it. And I want to get in a little bit to the psychology of that and why that's actually important, and why that's important for something like coaching and teaching, and that, well, how you coach the mind, how you develop an operational understanding of motivation and need, and what need is, and how need is different than wants, and like how in psychology need is a very specific word. It's a biological word. It's a, well, again, it's like I shouldn't limit myself. It's not just biological. Needs aren't just biological, right? We're going to be talking about this sort of like, obviously you have needs that are biological, and I don't have to recap the Maslow hierarchy, but like there's this idea that, again, if I was doing this as a PowerPoint, I'd snip this piece out. But whatever, I like got lost a little bit on my rant. So you guys are saying, it's okay, Mike. We're trying a new style here. So perceived freedom. I feel like I have perceived. Nah, I won't. That doesn't work as a segue, but yeah, I feel like I have perceived freedom here because no one's. I can't see any of my audience's reaction. So here we go. Perceived freedom. A state in which a person feels that what she or he is doing is done by choice and because they want to. I want to make this point that, yeah, like Neulinger's idea is that one of the most important psychological variables is people hate being in situations where they feel like they don't have control over what they're doing. And the weird thing is, and this is where the perceived aspect of this definition comes in, it's like at a certain level, the perception is what has the huge effect on the person's psychology, right? Like people. So we're going to play with this idea a bit today, right? That like it's not necessarily objective freedom, it's subjective freedom. Right? Another way of saying subjective freedom would be perceived freedom. Right? Your subjective world is your perceived world. Those words aren't like that. And again, sorry, I gotta stop saying this. And if you've never watched my videos, you've probably already clicked it off because it's probably annoying how I keep commenting on the process. But it's like, I'll get more comfortable as we get a few more slides in. But yeah, so like that perceived and subjective, I kind of just stumbled into that. They're not obviously the exact same word. Highly related though. So if we're looking at this definition, so I think what I'll do is I'll like talk, and then when I switch slides, I'll go full screen in case people are taking notes, and then I'll sort of maybe like show you my beautiful bald head in between. Again, I would cut that. Okay, intrinsic motivation. People are intrinsically motivated when they engage in an activity for its own sake. You already know this, right? You've already taken notes in past classes, and you've probably been like, yeah, extrinsic motivation is carrots and sticks, right? That's a classic saying. It's like that's like a reference to donkey training, where it's like either you have the carrot in front of the donkey to motivate it to walk forward, or you're hitting it in the butt with a stick from behind to motivate it to walk forward. Both ideas are to motivate it to walk forward. One's by avoiding punishment, and one's by seeking reward. And all of that I should have saved for the next slide on intrinsic. Or actually, since this is a free flow presentation, a little bit more. Let me just show this first, right? So like what I was just saying there about the sticks and the carrots, it's like they're the motivations originating outside the person, right? That the motivation is the means to the end. You're doing the thing to get the thing. You're either trying to get away from the stick that's hitting you, or you're trying to get the carrot that's in front of you. You're not walking for walking's sake. You're being extrinsically outside motivated. So now it's like, and this is where I want to challenge you, and this is where I'm trying to this is where I'm trying to kind of speak to this directly, right? It's like I obviously know you've heard these terms before, but I'm trying to kind of relate this specifically to the idea of coaching and this idea of rewards, because this is really important. It's like you have to be careful rewarding people with stuff. Oh, you did a good job. Here's money for that, because now all of a sudden it's like, in that person's mind, does that performance get tied to that thing? And like, now do you have to pay every time? And now does it have to be actually a scheduled reward? And now a progressive scheduled reward? And what happens if it doesn't? And how does that affect performance long term? And what if you have to actually engage in like hundreds of repeated interactions with this person or this child or your team that you're coaching or your employee or your spouse, right? Because like, and don't think that rewards have to necessarily be manipulative, right? Like, this is what I want to try to get into with this presentation is like a kind of deeper or not a deeper exploration into this concept of motivation. It's one of the most core things about what you are, right? Like, what I'm going to make the argument at the end of this presentation that I'm jumping all over that, like, basically what's different about us is our personality, our motivation system, and our attitudes. Not our motivational system, I shouldn't have said that. Our motivational aims. So if you're looking at this, right, it's like one big advantage of extrinsic motivation, right? So it's not like it never works. It's really good at getting people that don't want to do it, right? So say you're like teaching a class and it's day one and you're trying to get people to participate and you're like, well, I know no one's going to want to do it, and so I'm going to bring a bunch of chocolate bars and we're going to do some Kahoot activity that's going to be silly and kind of fun, and I'm going to be like kind of treat it like a game show and be like chocolate bars for the win. And I've actually done this stuff all the time and it actually always works. But it's like that works for like a icebreaker. That doesn't work to teach a whole class that way. And it certainly wouldn't work like teaching people like yourselves, right? Like the system of, and the reason why I'm just saying it's like the more complex the thing, the less intrinsic motivation works to a certain extent. And like, so it's really good at initiating participation. It's not good at long term, well, the next point, it's a poor long term driver of complex performance. And so like I want to touch on that because I think that's actually pretty interesting, right? So it's actually strong and weak. It's strong short term, weak long term. And it's not just that simple, because it also, another thing that has a big influence on effectiveness is the complexity. And we'll talk a bunch about that. Okay, so I'm going to just cycle back for a sec here. Yeah, so, and again, this is my first time doing excuse me, doing a full like prezi like this. It's actually pretty fun. And again, I hope you can like forgive a little bit of the back and forth and the opening and closing of these screens. People are intrinsically motivated when they engage in an activity for its own strength, like, own sake. So I said before, like whether the donkey, oh, that fan turned off, nice. Whether the donkey's trying to get away from the stick or trying to get to the carrot, it's not walking just to walk. With intrinsic motivation, you going out for a walk to relax at night or whatever, it's like sort of just for the thing. But it's also sort of not. And you saw how I kind of made a mistake even in that example, right? Because it's like we start to realize, like, okay, well, I went for a walk because I like walking, but it's like, but I even just said in how I meant to say that. I said you went for a walk to relax, and it's like that's another motive-based outcome, right? Relaxing would be a good example of earlier when I was stumbling around and saying like there's positive motives, right? Like it's not everything that you're trying to reward. It's not always in this way of trying to like control or manipulate a behavior, although it's clearly that. And if we're going to get into like talking about people like Skinner and stuff, he wanted to behavioral control everyone. Right? There's a reason why Skinner. Well, there's just not that I support it, but there was a reason why people like considered him like one of the most hated people in America, right? Because he was basically like really blunt about this idea of like people being trainable, and that the government should be heavily involved in it. And if you wanted to know more about what I was just rambling about there about Skinner, just there's like a New York Times article about it that goes. If you just look up Skinner New York Times article, most hated man in America, you'll find it. Okay, so people are and if you've taken classes with me before, you've heard me talk about that. People are intrinsically motivated when they engage in an activity for its own strength, as we've been saying, out of sheer engagement or without expecting a tangible payoff for their efforts. Right? It's like, say, for example, when I'm done this before I go to bed. So it's like I'm doing this on Friday night at 11:52 right now. So it's like when this is over, I'm probably going to watch some sports highlights and then go to bed. It's like, well, why am I going to watch the sports highlights? It's like, well, maybe that helps me relax a bit or whatever. But it's like, this is what we're going to get into, because just because we're not great at labeling what we're getting from things doesn't mean we're not getting things from things. And again, if I was doing this in PowerPoint, I would say that better and cut that, but that is what it is. Basically, I'm going to be making this point that this is going to be Dicey and Ryan's work, that like the main psychological goals are relatedness, competence, and autonomy. And when we lose focus on that is when we start to get into trouble psychologically. I love your class. This is fun. Okay. So then I'd already shown this, but then I know what you're all thinking, because at this point in the presentation, we're like 18 minutes in, and you're thinking like how does this relate to cockroaches? And that joke kills in person, and I feel like it just bombed asynchronously or whatever. Okay, but basically, the idea here is like I just have a cool cockroach-related experiment to show you. So what happened in this experiment is it's looking at how pressure, motivational pressure, based on being observed by others affects performance. Okay, so what you do in this scenario is, I don't know if you're seeing like my mouse or not, but basically you start, you can, I'll keep my mouse off the screen. You can see where the word start is at the bottom of the graphic, right? And it's like, that's where the cockroach starts, and it's going towards the goal at the top. So remember, every time there's a goal, what's a goal? It's something you're motivated towards, right? Whether you're talking about the cockroach moving towards the goal, which in this case is food, or whether you're talking about like scoring a goal in a hockey game, it's like that's also a outcome oriented, motivated target. So as this cockroach is moving towards the goal, what you do is you time it, right? So and again, it's like any of these experiments that are oftentimes like representing animal experiments, or in this case an insect experiment. When you hear them depicted in the textbook or in a video or something, they make it sound like they did this with like 6 of them or whatever, or it's like one cockroach. It's like they're doing this like hundreds of times, and what they're finding is that these cockroaches actually, they start to see like, okay, they take a certain amount of time to get from A to B, and then they start to say, okay, what we're going to do is all of those little triangles are little glass kind of window things, and what like kind of like so that there can be other cockroaches put in there that can watch, right? So just basically just think of it as adding an audience. So now you're going to put the cockroach in again and get it to go from the start to try to find its food and see if it increases its speed. Let me just switch examples quick in case I've lost you. It's like I'm doing a bunch of push. It's like, can I do more push-ups by myself in my room or with all of you around me cheering for me? It's like kind of obvious. I could probably do a few more at least with like just the social pressure of everybody being there and me wanting to, like, just whatever social dynamics that is, right? So what we're trying to see here is like, does the pressure of the other insects increase the performance of the cockroach? What we find is that it does, right? But unless, okay, again, my reveal there was brutal because I didn't set it up perfectly. The presence of other cockroaches makes the cockroach that you're examining faster as long as all it has to do is simply move forward. On the right, you're seeing a more complicated one, right? So it's the same kind of general idea, but notice how on the right, you're literally starting on the right side there, and the cockroach has to come to the middle and then make a decision. Is my food up or is it down? So that seems like a small change, but remember, to the like cognitive system of a cockroach, that's a huge increase in complexity. So now the question is, okay, does the presence of the other cockroaches in the audience boxes affect performance? So what you find here is actually pretty interesting. I'm going to go full screen so you can see what I have in the yellow. The presence of other cockroaches facilitated performance on easy tasks and hampered it on difficult tasks. So now think about that for a sec. What does this imply? That as long as what the cockroach was doing is simple and straightforward and kind of it was able to put the blinders on, that pressure made it perform better. But as soon as the task increased in cognitive complexity, the pressure made the cockroach do worse. So now I used the push-up example before. Now let me use a comparative example of like, so say we're doing our class in person, and all of you are in my class, and I'm like, okay, I pick one of you or ask for a volunteer. That's how I would do it. I would never pick on you to pick one of you to do push-ups. That's like nightmare situation. But like, say one of you wants to do it, and so you come up to the front and you start doing push-ups and we start cheering for you or whatever. It's like that's gonna make you better at doing push-ups. I can predict, and I would put money on the fact that you do the most push-ups you've ever done in your life. Now let me switch this scenario. I call you to the front of the classroom and I open a Word document and I share it so that the whole class can see. So it's on like a projector system or whatever, like you probably have at your Nipson classrooms. And it's like, and I say, okay, I want you to write a paragraph explaining the difference between capitalism and socialism in like a really direct way and without any bias. And I want you to kind of really get to the essence of it. Go. It's like now having other people watching you is going to make your performance worse. And that's the point of this experiment, sort of. And the reason I wanted to show you this is Zonk et al. 1969 experiment, right? It's not that it has this interesting point. It's the point, basically, right? The point that I'm trying to make here is the yellow, that like pressure increases performance the simpler the thing, and hurts performance the more complex the thing. Pressure in the crowd cheering helps the Raptor players play more intense defense, but it doesn't help them make three-pointers or free throws, right? It's like yelling at your team to run faster. Well, that's an interesting thing. We should talk about that at some point because that brings in a whole bunch of dynamics. It's actually a major problem that coaches make, especially if you're playing like a sport like soccer and you don't have an option to have tons of subs, and you actually can interfere with athletes' ability to self-regulate and pace. But again, I'm digressing. Okay, I think you guys got the point with the cockroach study. One thing I want to talk about a lot more on this channel as we move forward is some of this. This is going to seem like a weird segue, but I'll pull it together. This under talked about pairing of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, right? So you hear all the time at like length at nausea about fight or flight, and it's important, right? Fight or flight is important. Um, and then sometimes you'll hear people say fight, flight, or freeze. I kind of prefer the term. Looking at fight or flight is like a threat detection system. I think evolutionarily that's more what it is. And then fight or flight or freeze are behavioral, psychobehavioral responses within a broader threat detection system. And some of the biology of this threat detection system is what we call the sympathetic nervous system, that when you're stressed out, that your pupils dilate and it inhibits your salivation and it affects your breathing and accelerates, which is why you get the shortness of breath and you get this like accelerated heart rate. And the reason all these things are happening is because of the redistribution of energy based on this need to deal with an emergency. But if we you've heard about this before, right? And you've probably like written papers about this. But the thing that I find so interesting is how much less time people are spending teaching about things like the parasympathetic nervous system, right? That like so often in nature, the cure is baked in with the condition almost, or I should think of a better way of saying that. But it's like, even think of what parasympathetic means. It's parallel to it. It's the rest and digest system, right? It's what you turn back on to calm down. And again, your class. That's why I included that relaxation response video about autogenics, because autogenics is like a really specifically designed method of trying to activate this parasympathetic nervous system. So it's arousal, right? So the reason I wanted to show this is because this is kind of what we mean when we say this physiological arousal and stress are, again, I'm struggling to not say it. They're not the same, obviously. But then again, it's like, well, what do you mean? Because at a certain point, we're just like playing with definition, right? And it's like, we don't have to be silly about it. We all know what we're saying here. It's like, it's obviously a physiological need. It's only a matter of time before it's the most stressful thing in your life. Like, it's like if you don't have food, or you don't have water, or you're in a massive sleep deprivation situation, that physiological need, it doesn't take very long for that to become, well, over arousal, right? So now, so sometimes we're talking about this idea too, is that like, I'm going to bring up like a grade 11 or 12 biology word, homeostasis. If you remember that word, that means like why when you get hot you sweat, or when you get cold you shiver. It's like your body's attempt to like reestablish the middle. Homeostasis, to, I don't reestablish the middle. I don't know. I started that like as if I knew the Latin breakdown of it. I'm not really sure. I'm sure the word middle is in there. But anyways, so yeah, so it's like we're talking about tissue deficit or biochemical imbalances. So like hunger, thirst, and rest are the easier ways to say that. And that like sometimes when we're under aroused, right? So when we're like bored, basically, we might have motivation towards seeking out things that are more novel or different or challenging. Or but if we're over aroused, we might have motivation to seek more relaxed settings or more predictable things, right? And it's like the point I'm making here is just how much we underestimate sometimes the physiological underpinning of the motivational state we're in at a given moment. So this whole presentation is sort of just on this idea of what we mean by needs, and that last slide was just sort of part of this idea that some of the needs are like bubbling to the surface as a result of us being living organisms, right? It's like we need certain things, and some of the things that we need shape our it's like I heard a really good presentation once that was saying like anything that you do to make people feel uncomfortable when you're presenting, right? So it's like every time you lose the audience, it actually, from a psychology perspective, and you students will find this interesting, it's like it actually makes people like notice that they have to go to the bathroom or that they're thirsty or that they're hungry or makes them more likely to remember something about dinner later, or like it's like the brain almost like checks out for that split second and almost sets itself up for additional distractions. So you can see at like a really functional level how things like even just well, just think about yourself. Like I don't need to go abstract. Think about if you're trying to listen to this. Say we're in a live lecture and I'm going on like some epic rant. I'm just like ranting, and I don't mean epic isn't cool. I mean epic isn't long. I'm just like going, and you have to go to the bathroom, and you're just like wait, and it's like you know that I'm going to take a break as soon as I'm done this slide, and I just keep going and going and going. It's like obviously that will hurt your ability to pay attention, right? Because you're getting physical motivation to well, to address that physiological need is the word of the day. Need. So the origins of needs, many of our psychological needs are acquired through our interactions with our social world. Right? And this is like not a shock to any of you. And if you're in my classes and we talked about like Erickson most specifically in this idea of psychosocial and how much of our psychology is actually so deeply interconnected with our social experience that like it's somewhat just theoretical or linguistic to talk about them as different things. Like, and again, this is like just another way of getting back to nature nurture and this discussion of like you in that there's you and that you're in a world. Belonging is a basic human need. Evolutionary psychology, this need for belonging is hardwired in the DNA of social animals. In cognitive psychology, we teach that the pain of social rejection is experienced in a similar way as physical pain. Right? So it's like if you were to make an argument that belonging is a core, I'm almost making the point here that it's social belonging is talked about as psychological and social, but only because we're not properly giving proper attention to the biological critical essentialness of belonging. I don't know if I did a good job describing that slide, but it's like there's not a more important point in psychology. Right? And it's like, well, because the flip of it is like just how devastating isolation is. Alright, my friends. I am hardcore nervous because it's like 35 minutes in, and I just paused it to refill my coffee. And I don't know. My only critique about this Prezi experience is that it feels a little like I kind of gotta just do it to the end, and then I'll figure out if it's working or not. But then again, it's like it seems like it is, and if this comes out again, if this is like all choppy, you probably won't see it because I'll just scrap it. But it's been a pretty enjoyable experience, and again, it's like you can kind of tell I've been out of the. I was producing a lot of video content for quite a while there, and then I kind of had like a week or two off of not really off at all, but like marking and stuff. As you know, I've emailed you about it, but I find that when I don't do videos for a while and then I get back into doing it, it's like, and this is like medics. I'm talking about the problem that I keep talking about, but it's weird. It's like you have to get over it, and this is why I think with like your assignments, it's good to get practice at it. You have to like get over the fact of it's yourself talking, and like it's harder in this Prezi because it's like more just superimposed on myself, whereas in PowerPoint I'm just like the little person in the corner. But again, it's like you push me to try something outside of my comfort zone. I'm a little more outside my comfort zone right now. But it's like, how'd you push me? Well, I've been spending the last 2 weeks like reading all your assignments and all my Conestoga students' assignments too. And like, I know yours was like a couple weeks ago, but it gave me so much confidence to know that I have such like a amazingly awesome group of students. And I honestly mean that. And it's, again, if you're watching this and you're at the 40-minute mark almost, and you're one of my digital classroom academics, I appreciate you so deeply. Okay, so let's get back to this. So I hope this is working. So the three core psychological needs. This is Decky and Ryan, and if you, I believe it's 2000. I'm doing this without notes, although I realized that like I actually can add notes to this. But this is a famous study. They're a famous idea, and I don't know. I think I was trying to think before like, cause at break, at break, when I paused it to get a coffee, I was trying to think like, so this is around 2000 they came out with this work, and I think it would be considered social psychology, right? So like if you were to classify this within psychology, they would be sort of where, well, social cognitive, where social and cognitive kind of meet. Again, this is where I've kind of reared my head again up and like kind of took my head up and looked around again in the academic world with this NIPSing stuff, because to be honest, it's like I finished my PhD 8 years ago. I've been working at Conestoga for like 10 years, 12 years, full time for probably 10 years. And then and when I finished this, like I was at Waterloo forever, right? Because like I don't know why I'm going all personal, but it's just different when I'm freestyling a little bit more because it's not in PowerPoint. But like, I went to Waterloo forever. Like, it's weird, but I paid like tuition to Waterloo almost a full 13 years, and it's because I did 2 undergrad degrees and a master's and a PhD, and it took. And I'm not bragging because it's not. I took longer than most people on my PhD. Like I took almost 8 years on my PhD, and it's because I also was like working a full time job, had a kid, had got married. So those are all. I'll just leave the list at that. There's probably other things I could add to the list. That whole rant that again I could maybe trim out was to just say that I appreciate you. It's like I've taught a few classes here and there at University of Waterloo. As you know, I teach full time at Conestoga, and then this has been the only other place I've taught. And I was kind of like a little bit a disillusioned academic, a little bit of like I always loved being a student. I always had some really good mentorish relationships with profs. Had some good buddies. Never really felt super. I don't know. I never felt at home at like conferences and trying to get into journals and trying to play the whole game. It just was never. I just kept feeling like the character in Catcher in the Rye, thinking everything seemed phony. But it's like that's a weird reference, but yeah, it's so that's why I'm saying it's like for me like showing my head again and like relating to you students, it's fun. It's so cool. So and again, it's like it's and let's check out this for a segue. Decky and Ryan would understand this and say this is relatedness, right? It's like it's not surprising that it's like honestly just not psychologically surprising that talking to a group of young academics about topics that we both care about is like psychologically rewarding for me. It's like watching your project was awesome. Those projects were awesome. Like some of you wrote incredible papers. Some of you made incredible audio podcasts and videos. And the only problem with those was that I was the only one that got to see them. It's like I felt like honored. I did. And it's not like I felt honored. It's like, yeah, it was an honor. So, this again. So, what I'm kind of doing with this is like, this presentation is I want to kind of really hit some of these ideas. Locus of control. I'm calling this here a central tendency of mental health. It's like so important. And again, I know that you know this word, right? Like we literally went over it in the developmental psych course that a lot of you have taken with me. So it's like, but again, I want to kind of just step back for a second and be like, okay, well, what's locus of control really? When we really think about it, it's this idea of like, when you're going through your day and something bad happens, are you like cursing the sky and mad at God and mad at or whatever you believe, or mad at the world, or mad at just situations, or just think everything's wrong and just it's everything else? What's the location of the control in your life? Right? Locus, location. It's just, again, it's just like needlessly confusing. It's a decent term, I guess, but like, what they're really saying is like, how much in, and this is such like a personal question, because at a certain point you could, if I asked you about it, it's really getting to the core of self-talk, right? Because it's getting to this idea of like, when you're making sense of your experience, are you, who is that character in the story? Right? Like, are you somebody that's living in a world that you're actively shaping and you're moving through, and you're controlling what you can control? And obviously, like, we don't control everything, and it's, you can't control the weather, you can't control all kinds of things, you can't control. But at the same time, we know one of the most robust findings in psychology is the laundry list of negative outcomes associated with adopting an external locus of control long term, with thinking from the perspective of the world being against you. Here's the weird thing, even if it is in certain situations, it's not the world being against you. I said it poorly there. To think that you have no control. And even in situations where you have limited control, it's even more important to believe in and develop confidence in your ability to control those small things that you can control. Right? And so an internal locus of control, so the opposite of an external. So external meaning thinking that everything's being controlled by things outside of you, just to go back to the definition for a sec. An internal meaning that you largely control your outcomes, right? Which is actually just a quick saying, but it's actually really deep because it means like that, well, you actually have a big say into whether you have a bad day or a good day, and whether your night with your girlfriend or boyfriend goes well, and whether it's an extreme ownership over your life. And there's threats with that, right? Because it's like then all of a sudden you have to like take responsibility for things, and it's like there's some comfort in maybe thinking that poor you or whatever. And it's like, again, it's like not saying that like there's not situations where we obviously have, there's evil in the world and there's things that are bad that happens. My point is that if we're going to be talking about promoting and cultivating and maintaining as high a level of mental health as we can personally kind of foster, we can't lie to ourselves. One of the strongest findings in psychology is that the more difficult the situation, the less helpful it is to get into this, like, well, an external locus of control. Let's just use this specific term. It's psychologically, it's almost like the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's what you would, if I wanted to make you less mentally healthy. It's such a difficult, deep topic, and it's like, I think locus of control is one of the most important ideas in psychology that is treated as like maybe a 2-3 slide intro comment. So okay, here's another one for you to write down. So this self-determination, I want to use this term for a sec, because, and I know this, and again, this is going to be like a different presentation because part of it is I'm kind of trying something different, and also just the nature of this presentation. A lot of the presentations in this specific course have been a little bit more, like, say for example, the existentialism and phenomenology presentation were like, I hope at least some of it was maybe new stuff to you. I know some of this stuff, you've heard these terms before, but I'm trying to tie it together a little bit differently and hopefully hit it from a slightly different angle. Like, for example, think about self-determination. It's like, if you're not self-determined, who's shaping you, right? Who's determining what you're doing, right? It's like, and this is where the language gets a little confusing, and I want to just step back and tell you this in case anyone's confused by this, because this is sort of a topic. It's hard to talk about this and not stumble into a conversation on free will, because, and this can be a big topic in the course I teach next term. And this was an age-old religious debate, right? Like, is the word that they would use, are things determined, right? Or the word that actually would have been used is like designed. Is there an intelligent design? Like, did God design things a certain way? Or is there, like, at the level of like shaping all the decisions about your life, and it's like it was kind of all just designed that way? Or are you exhibiting free will and choice as an independent agent? Now, where this gets tricky is it's not that simple, because it's not like it's only A or B. It's only completely designed by a creator being, or it's like complete self free will. Because that's like, I almost lost my point, but I didn't. I almost did. Right? Because it's like, if you're thinking about all this stuff that's like designed, this is where it gets awkward, right? Because like, what about if it's like a physiological, right? What if I'm like, my blood sugar gets low, or like my like internal liquid level gets a certain whatever, and I'm thirsty, right? And that motivates me to do something. Am I choosing that? Right? And so some of this, even though that design idea sort of tends to get framed in a religious way, you could also very much frame design evolutionarily. And Darwin even struggled with that word, right? Because it's like he was trying not to say the word, that it seemed like things were designed, because it's like, designed by who? Right? Is would be the obvious follow-up question. And that's where, if you remember, like the bio, if you earlier in the course when I was saying like what tripped Darwin out was, I was found this so interesting, is like the human eye. And what tripped him out was like, how is that not designed? The human eyeball is so complicated. The human visual system is so complex. They still can't copy the complexity of an AI yet, right? Like they can obviously create cameras way more advanced than an eye, but not visual processing systems that can like, what it really struggles with is like actually what isn't important. You probably heard me rant on this before, right? But like, what's amazing about your brain is its ability to like focus on the relevant, and like this whole time I've been talking to you, I've been like paying no attention to like this side of the room, and like you haven't. Like it's like we're constantly not paying attention to things and paying attention to some things, and you know, it's one of the most amazing things about your cognitive system. And you're probably sitting there saying, okay, Mike, so okay, you've now described the word self-determination, the very first term on the slide. Have we got to anything else yet? But this idea, it's actually important. It's like that actually self-determination, feeling like you're actually making choices that affect yourself. It's like so key. It's so central to mental health. Right? And it's like, despite that, oftentimes we're like heavily influenced by external regulation. Think of what external regulation means, right? Just like basically being controlled by the outside. Sorry, I didn't need to go back to myself just to make that point. Behavior is controlled by factors that are outside of the self. Right? So again, it's like very similar to extrinsic motivation, but like I want you to kind of maybe have like that deep thought about how it's the same thing. It's not the same thing, but it's sort of the same thing. That this ability to be controlled by other people's opinion and extrinsic motivation, that being controlled by other people's opinions, or wanting people to caring about other people's opinions, is a type of extrinsic motivation. Again, I'm free flowing a little bit here, but so now this is kind of interesting. I want to show these like kind of other terms that you might hear. So introjected, into self-jected, regulation, behaviors motivated. Here, I'll move my cursor right because I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's probably annoying if you can. Behaviors that are motivated. So remember, motivated. So these are things. Again, this is where like language, if you actually take it seriously, is actually so intensely deep that your behaviors are motivated. You're not just like randomly doing stuff. There's a drive. And again, motivation and drive are basically the same word. But there's a drive that is, well, motive, right? Or adding movement, adding what we would just call behavior. Yeah, it's wild how the behavior motivation relationship, it's like obvious and yet so deeply complex. So, yeah, for your note there, interjected regulation is this term that means like, okay, sometimes our behavior is motivated by things, these internal pressures that are influencing us, and it's related to like needs that we have that aren't those three that we talked about, right? Competence, self-determination, and relatedness. So what would be an example of something like that? Maybe like our need to be liked by certain people or whatever. Internal pressures. Yeah, and it's like, it's a weird title, right? Self-determination. So how do you like live your own life, make your own choices, and like leisure, right? Like and just like, because leisure is this word that like used to get used a lot more for like, your leisure time, or when you're not at work and not doing things that you have to do. Alrighty. Okay, so here's another one. Integrated regulation. Okay, so for this one, so these are just some different terms, right? So these are different types of intrinsic motivation, basically, right? All these regulations are just different types of extrinsic motivation, basically. The most self-determined form of extrinsic motivation. This is from when the internalization and integration of the intrinsic regulations so intense, right? It's like the desire to get the marks has become so intense that it's actually creating intrinsic, almost intrinsic motivation, right? So you're going to see here in a second that, so hang on, I'll just leave this up for a second in case anyone's taking notes. So I have here integrated. So now think about this, the most self-determined form of extrinsic motivation. So I'm going to show you kind of a spectrum in a second. You can see that this is like closer to the closest to intrinsic. Man, that's a tongue twister. That'll make more sense in just one sec. Right, so the idea is that, and this is a kind of, I'm like, it'll make more sense in just a second. I'll show like a super confusing looking chart here. This is like, oh man, it's weird. This is in 2000 and it looks like they could have made this a little more flashy. But it's basically saying that there's like not motivation or a motivation, and then there's extrinsic motivation, and then there's intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation, things we're intrinsically motivated for, can create a type of regulation. Like if we're really motivated to perform really well on something the next morning, that might make us like not want to go out the next night or whatever. But then it's like, well, okay, that's getting pretty close to integrated regulation. And so it's just like, I thought that you'd find this kind of interesting because I know that you've heard about this before, intrinsic and extrinsic. And, but if you're really interested in things like coaching and performance and studying this, and like other examples where this could be significant would be like, say, working with kids in like daycares or camps, or coaching kids, or, and not just kids, like any kind of performance based situation, understanding that different types of extrinsic motivation is could be key, right? And you see here how, like, if we were looking at this, I like this because this is like, it looks like a kind of just under impressive image, but it actually contains a lot here. You're looking at intrinsic motivation at the top, a motivation, or just not being motivated at the bottom, lack of motivation, and then extrinsic as being subdivided into sort of these four categories. And then you see along this right side, you see the self-determined, right? So intrinsic is the most self-determined, and then you see like how that kind of fits on the spectrum too, which is pretty neat. So this next idea I want to show you, cognitive autonomy. Alright, now I'm freaking because I just paused it and started recording again now, saying it's only 2 minutes. But I've only been talking for a few seconds. It must be an hour and 2 minutes. Alright. I'm just gonna trust that this is all working. Cognitive autonomy. This is kind of, the kind of final stretch of this presentation, the last like section here. I want to kind of talk about some different ideas, and cognitive autonomy is kind of just a term. I don't know if I made it up, because if you Google it, like, it exists. I definitely didn't make it up, but I was thinking about it, right? I was thinking about, like, probably when we were talking about like Erickson or something, and I was trying to think, like, how would I describe, if I had to, in my own words, describe cognitive autonomy, and I thought it was almost like one of these scenarios where like negation works best, where it's like I wasn't sure what the best way to describe it is, but I know exactly what it isn't. It's the exact opposite of being brainwashed, right? The cognitive autonomy is like, well, their freedom of thought scaled to the functional cognitive level. It actually is like the practice of having freedom of thought. And I think it's just a cool term, an important idea. So I thought you'd find this interesting. So this is Brem's work from 1969. The theory that people react against threats to specific behavioral freedoms, right? So, like, basically it's this idea that's actually a pretty strong idea in psychology, that basically if people feel like you're forcing them to do something that they don't want to do, that it'll make them less want to do it. And it sounds like so basic and almost like borderline childish, but it's like the way that I remember teachers explaining it back in the day in psych classes was like, if you're a parent and you tell your kids like they can't date anyone that has tattoos, expect them to have a boyfriend or girlfriend that has tattoos. It's like there's something in the human mind that really rebels against being told what to do. It's like if I tell you not to watch this movie, that there's this like movie that like people like, but you really shouldn't watch, blah blah blah. It's like, how many of you are like downloading it while I'm making that rant? Because it's like you don't want to be told what to do. And there's more and less extreme versions of it, especially if, like, what did that just say? I think I'm okay. Yeah, so, like, I think we're still recording here. This theory operates in 3 steps. Number 1, that people perceive, and I don't know why I put a mask there, just saying, well, the idea that, like, of the reaction that some people feel when feeling forced or whatever. People perceive an unfair restriction on their actions. A state of reaction or reactance is activated. And, irrational or rational, depending on situations, right? Because this applies in all kinds of situations. A person must do something about it, right? So it's like people feel like they're being put into a situation. They feel an emotional response to that, and that they need to do something about it. And what they need to do something about it is usually kind of digging into whatever the position is. Now the point is they don't necessarily tie that all together, right? It's like the person might not be tying together that what's digging them into the position is the fact that they're really sort of rebelling against the fact that they don't want someone telling them what to do. And the telling them what to do actually, that's actually so repellent that it's making it hard to hear anything. And the challenge I want to give you is, like, it's very easy to see whoever you disagree with as doing that, and harder to see that this is actually, like, something that all humans struggle with. Okay. Learned helplessness. So these are all. Let me go full screen here for the free note taken. Oh, I thought I was gonna glitch. Sorry, I'm like all nervous now that this isn't. I think it's because it's saying it's 7 minutes and 45 seconds. It's not showing, like, if it just said 1.7 minutes, and it's just not showing, like, the first hour, which has me stressed. So learned helplessness. You've talked about this before, right? Some of you, like, obviously we started the course talking about this, and it's like I'm including this somewhat to full circle it a bit, because this is a massively important concept when we're talking about coaching the mind. Learned helplessness is the opposite of coaching the mind. It's destroying the mind. It's that actually this phenomenon, which experiences of uncontrollable bad events, can create passive behaviors. That's so devastating when you think about it deeply, right? That, like, whether we're talking about a dog or the classic elephant example, or whether you're talking about, like, humans, that people can be in bad situations that are so overwhelming and that feel so out of control that they stop believing that it's like the most extreme form of an external locus of control. They stop believing that their actions matter, right? Like that devastating picture of that dog is like when you take a normal dog and you put it on a shock pad. And this was Sleekman's experiments, and they absolutely did shock dogs. And you shock the dog, it'll try to get away from that, unless it's been in a whole bunch of experiments like that before, and it's learned that trying to get away doesn't do anything. And then once it's learned that, you can put it into a situation where it actually could get away, and it won't even try to. And again, it's like that's where the tough link can be made to humans, right? Especially in relation to things like stress and depression and low self-esteem and the perceived lack of control that people can experience. But then I had there, it's also like can be helpful in understanding some of the psychology associated with the challenges that some people with certain types of disabilities or certain people that are in certain types of long-term care settings face. Right, and like, again, a lot of you in this course are going to be interested in this also from like an early learning perspective, and how some of this learned helplessness is associated with things like low self-esteem and even frustration and being then more passive and giving up and lack of effort. And this is like, of course this is going to have massive impacts on things like school performance. Okay, Decky and Ryan also, I'm going to keep going with them for a bit because they also have this interesting idea around self-determination that you have to be careful with reward, right? And so they use this with like, they do this experiment with markers with the kids, right? Of like having kids play with markers, and they reward some of the kids, and they're looking at like how rewarding those kids affects their future play behaviors, right? So they thought that, and I'll just go through this, right? So they thought that like there's an important aspect of how choice and control are related, and in self-determination theory is this idea that people have an intrinsic desire to explore and understand their environment, and that starts really old, at a really young age, right? So it's like this idea that people are naturally curious, and I'll just jump ahead. The danger is if you start, if you incorrectly attach intrinsic rewards, like basically like pay the kid to play nice with other kids, it's like you can corrupt that system. There's a danger of rewards. Extrinsic rewards can be used to increase participation, but they tend to undermine people's self-determination. Now people are doing it to get the chocolate bar, not because they actually want to. A shift can occur from an internal locus of causality to an internal locus of causality. Right? It's like now they're doing it for the reward, not for the, well, enjoyment of the thing. Right? The game, the sport, the learning, whatever. So now, and this is a good term associated with that, the over-justification effect. This tendency for intrinsic motivation to go down when people have been rewarded. So now think about this. It's like, say I'm like, all of a sudden, okay, if you make a good video, you get $100. Then you all do it. Then on the next assignment, I'm like, oh no, that was just for the one assignment. And now everyone's like bitter that they put so much time in the video, and you're amazing students. That wouldn't be the case, and I don't know, whatever. That was a weird made up situation. I'm an hour and 13 minutes in. I'm not restarting over a bad example. But yeah, you get the point, right? It's like if I'm rewarding you money for stuff and then I don't anymore, and then you're like, well, I don't even really want to do it anymore, but maybe you liked doing it at the beginning. I just wrecked that for you. My like in my poorly designed schedule of reinforcements of rewards actually made you shift from intrinsic to extrinsic motivation. And then when the reward scheme lost its novelty, it had no power. Over justification effect. This tendency of intrinsic motivation to diminish once that activity has been associated with an intrinsic reward. So they did the study on children playing with colored markers that I sort of referenced for a second. Right, you pay kids to play with markers. I'm going to show you this in a second. And then you see if like, does that affect their future likelihood of playing? Or like a different example would be, and I think Nesbitt does this too, a sports player getting paid money for every goal they score. And then it becomes about, it can be about the money again. Like it, obviously, if we're talking like about a pro athlete or something, it's totally different. I'm talking more about like, is it a good idea to like reward your kid every time they get a goal? Now, this is all within reason, right? Like, say, like your kid obviously gets a goal and you like celebrate it. It's like, that's amazing. You should definitely do that. And it's great to have family moments like that. But my point isn't that. My point is like, say like your kid's like getting a bit older and they're playing competitive sports and like the whole goal is to score to get that reward. It's like, well, no, the goal should be playing the game. And again, it's creating it's the shift from intrinsic to extrinsic. That's the key point here. Right, a week later, the markers are put out, and the researchers observe that um, kids that had previously, so it's like no reward offered, time spent playing is intrinsic motivation. I don't know why I put it like that. That's a weak way of writing it, but I can't just change it because we're not recording slide by slide. Okay, so anyways, a week later, the markers are put out, and researchers observed that the kids who had previously expected and received rewards were no longer interested in playing. Why would I still care about drawing with markers when I'm not even getting paid for this anymore? Kids who didn't receive rewards maintained their interest, and kids who were unexpectedly received rewards maintained interest. So the only ones that didn't want to do it anymore were the ones that were rewarded before and then had the reward removed. Okay. So we're getting close to the end here. I don't know, you might wonder why like I have the it's funny how a picture of Freud in his office is sort of like in my mind the sort of the logo of the NU digital classroom. But at least in terms of like YouTube. Because I think, one of my goals with some of my courses is to, I hope, create situations where, obviously like any kind of post-secondary situation is going to have an intrinsic motivation aspect, but I'm aiming more at this like integrated intrinsic motivation because obviously you're in like a competitive academic situation and you're wanting to get good grades and stuff like that, but it's like, okay, but if you can somehow pair that with also being engaged in like this like passion for knowledge, it's like you just move to a different level. It's just a different level of engagement. And again, I was going to make that point that I hope that like some of these courses have provided a little bit of room for you to do that. And the point I wanted to add to that is also like I feel like you've done that for me. I feel like it's been an autonomy supportive environment for me as a teacher, which has been a real gift. So now I want to kind of finish on these last 3 points that I want to leave you with this thought that some of the biggest differences between people, it's like in psychology, we can get kind of sometimes lost in the depth of the forest. It's like, it's kind of interesting sometimes to simplify for a sec and look at this complicated relationship between our personality or our patterns of behaviors and thoughts and expressions of emotions and stuff like that. And then our motivation and our attitude and how these things interact and interplay. And it's like with whether we're talking about personality, right? So actually, that was bad timing to switch screens. Personality refers to enduring patterns of things like thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So now, if you're writing this down, I'll give you a second to write that while I kind of rant here. Enduring patterns is a key point there. The whole idea of personality is that you're a person that's not just randomly responding to things in your environment constantly. It's not like you like go into a store and someone says something to you and your response is like a complete random in the moment generated thing. It's like, no, no, no. It's like if someone's like, hey, how is it going? And I'm like, good, how are you? It's like that good, how are you is like preloaded. It's like so many things, or even just my, when I walk into the store that I like make eye contact with the person, it's like, I've already learned to do that. It's like so much of things are like, or it's already my style to do that, are like styles or patterns of behaviors and ways of thinking about things and ways of engaging people and emotions, and that the point is that we carry that with us across situations in a way that's almost the opposite of random. It's like a style. It's a person it's a person style, a personality. Right? Remember Jung would go like a step farther and say there's different personality types. But yeah, so there's personality, and then the second piece is motivation, right? That there's motive, and motivation refers to the state of tension in individual experiences that arouses or maintains or directs behavior towards a goal, right? So I should do each of those. That like sometimes motivation is what kind of gets us, well, arouses us towards the goal, or that keeps us aroused towards the goal, or that focuses us on one goal over others. This is another key word here. I should have had it like underlined or something. Motivational disposition. The set of motivations. So this is basically just this idea that like you're motivated by different things than I am, which is kind of obvious. And then you could just say like, okay, well that's, you have a different motivational disposition. Just like just a fancy way of saying like personality at a motivation level. Active motives are called aroused motives or manifest needs. Again, it's just to show you that like sometimes you see this different language, right? Sometimes you hear it in the literature as active motives or aroused motives or manifest needs, and it's all just, people wanting their word to be the common one, but it's all just the same thing. And then my last slide here. It's like so wild. The attitude is everything is like such like almost, well, it's like so incredibly cliche at a certain level, but also so deeply true at another level. And just like personality, and this is the kind of thing, right? It's like so. My point at a couple slides ago is that there's sort of like you can look at the differences between people as sort of being like, okay, we often talk about the differences between people as being their personality, but I'm sort of making an argument here that, okay, well, yeah, and then there's also differences in attitude style, and there's also differences in motivational dispositions. And those are all three key psychological differences between people. Attitudes are these relatively stable and enduring positive or negative feelings that people have about people or objects or ideas or institutions or issues. But this idea of relatively stable and enduring, right? So it's like, it's not like and of course our attitudes can change and we can have new attitudes and stuff, but it's like, it's not like, even if you have a new or changed attitude, think about it changed from something else, right? And it probably is either you had new information or you changed how you thought about it for some, well, probably because you had new information or you're under a new pressure or whatever it is that caused you to have the new idea. But even that, like, my point is that, like, we're an hour and 25 minutes and I lost my point there. Attitude's everything. Oh, yeah, just that In the keywords are stable and enduring. You're carrying it between situations. It's an argument against randomness. The stability and enduringness of attitude, the argument that can be made for motivational disposition, and the idea of personality are all speak to the uniqueness of all of us as well, as unique individuals, as unique human beings. Thank you, my friends. This has been fun. I hope it wasn't brutal to watch. I hope you enjoyed it if you watched this full thing. We're at almost an hour and a half, which is looking at, and that's me assuming this is working. It says it's at 26 minutes. So hopefully this worked. Love yous. Stay well. Take care of your family. Just keep being good people. Reach out if you need me for anything. I'm done my teaching basically for the year at my full-time job. I still have like a bunch of stuff to do more administratively in May and June, but I'm not teaching directly, so my schedule's quite different than it's been this winter. And if anyone needs to reach out or needs help with anything or support with any other projects or any, I guess you're done all your projects now, but just anything, reach out. All right, now the moment of truth to see if this works. If you see this, then it worked enough to post it. All right, cheers, my friends.